Hello and welcome to this video about how I learnt Spanish. So I thought I'd take you through my whole journey learning the Spanish language, from introductions to the language when I was at school all the way through to conducting dissertation research in Madrid in Spain and volunteering as an English teacher in Ecuador. So when I was at school, at primary school, we had to learn French. It was compulsory, and although there was a lot of grammar focus, the teacher was really good and I did really enjoy it. And I remember in the last year or two of studying at primary school, this teacher offered to do evening classes in Spanish for anyone who was interested. So I was lucky to have an opportunity to start first meet Spanish in that context. And it definitely, it made me interested in the language from then on. But I have to say, at that time, the teacher had told us it was easier than French, but actually going to her, occasional evening classes, I actually found it a lot harder than French at that time, just because we'd studied French so thoroughly, in the classroom with her. And during the evening classes, it would be, in a spare classroom somewhere, not really set up for a lesson, like a normal lesson. And she'd give us these black and white, very grainy handouts with dialogues on. And I just remember being sort of taken aback by the Spanish use of, upside down exclamation and question marks at the start of phrases. And just finding it a bit strange in comparison to French at that time. But definitely found it interesting. And so when I was in secondary school, in our second year, we had the option, we had to choose which subjects we'd want to start building towards for our GCSE exams at the age of 16. And one of the options was a second language, in addition to French in my case. And I automatically knew I'd want that to be Spanish instead of, for example, German at that time, as I'd enjoyed it enough when I'd come across Spanish previously. So I studied French and Spanish up to GCSE level at secondary school. And although, being that age, in your teens, especially, isn't it, early teens, where you spend a lot of time in class chatting with your mates and stuff, but even though I probably did that a bit more than I should have done, I still enjoyed the lessons, still really enjoyed learning French and Spanish, and the teachers were great. And they'd sometimes let us watch films in the languages to keep things interesting. And because I enjoyed it enough, or because I enjoyed it so much, I managed to summon enough time and effort on my part to prepare for the GCSE exams when they came around. So I was able to get an A star in both French and Spanish thanks to that, and the fact the teachers were really great. So I was very lucky to have that foundation in Spanish and French, as they complement each other up to a point in terms of a lot of shared vocabulary. And then at the age of 17 and 18, which a lot of people, one of the most common qualifications people study in England at that age are A levels, and you usually have to choose 3, as they're more detailed than GCSEs. And I gave serious consideration to making 2 of those choices, French and Spanish, but in the end I decided it might leave, my resume a bit unbalanced if there were 2 languages in there, and therefore, only 1 slot for a more traditional subject, in inverted commas. So in the end I decided to choose French, as I'd studied it longer, and therefore hopefully it would be a little bit easier in that sense, or slightly less time required to study for it. And the other 2 I chose were history and economics, just because I love learning about the world and how it works. So I did French, history, economics at A level, but I always wanted to come back to Spanish one day. And I wasn't quite sure when or how I would, but I always had that hope that I would do eventually. Now, after studying French at A level, I always wanted to, continue learning languages, not just Spanish, but French as well, because even though, the teachers at school were amazing, I'm always very grateful to them. It was genuinely a really great experience. Like I think most people find studying a language at school, and you might be the same. There's inherent limitations to learning a language at school that no teacher can overcome in the classroom. It's just the way it is, unfortunately. So when you've got a classroom of 20 to 40 students, you have to, there's not much more you can do than go through a textbook together and do the exercises in it, explain the exercises and stuff. Obviously there's ways you can get the most out of that situation, but there's just no time to implement some of the things that are essential for becoming fluent in a language. The most pertinent example, I guess, being immersion. Spending hours and hours listening to the language and watching content in the language, and when you can, reading the language. And it's just not possible to do that in a classroom setting at school. Now, obviously, looking back, if I'd known this back then, I would have, in my spare time, spent a lot of time, trying to listen to Spanish and French whilst I was studying it at school, but I had no idea about that at the time. So, yeah, it actually took an experience studying at the Sorbonne in Paris as a year abroad, whilst I was at university, for me to realise this and to realise how to learn languages. So, yeah, during my third year of university, I was very fortunate to have the opportunity to spend a year studying at the Sorbonne. And I was studying history. So basically it was a year at the Sorbonne studying history in French. Now, when I applied to do this, during my second year of university, I was eligible to do so because I'd done French at A-level. And so, yeah, technically speaking, by that criteria, it was enough. I was under no illusions, but in terms of my listening ability in French and my spoken ability in French, I wasn't ready to study in French at a French university. But the reason I wanted to go ahead with it was I hoped and felt that the experience itself would develop my French a lot. So, yeah, with that hope keeping me going, I went ahead with it, and I was very lucky that when I got there, at my reading level in French, which was actually not too bad after studying at A-level, that's one thing that school is capable of really doing a pretty good job with in terms of developing your reading level. That was able to keep my head above water for the first semester, as I was able to, we had loads of assignments to do, loads of research to do. I could read enough of, the articles, the books I was researching to get by, and to write coherent enough essays in French, although obviously they wouldn't have been perfect. And yeah, on that, obviously you won't be able to write at that stage, you won't be able to write an essay in French anywhere near as well as, an actual French person's essays in French, but thankfully most of the professors were very understanding and took into account that, certain, advanced grammar points may not be perfect all the time, but as long as the content you wrote was good enough, then they deemed it good enough. So that was obviously a great help, especially during the first semester. And what was especially helpful about this environment that was conducive to allowing me to improve through the experience itself was that in terms of the actual seminars, the actual lectures, my listening level was nowhere near what it needed to be to understand what the professors were saying for much of the lectures. I remember when I turned up to the first lecture/seminar double header of the semester. It went on for 3 hours. It was about France in the early modern period and about the French court and stuff. Not really my cup of tea, I have to say, but so that didn't help. But either way, I barely understood a sentence of what the professor was saying. Of course, lots of individual words jumped out, but I'd spent so little time actually listening to French before that this setting of listening to a French person rambling away in French for hours was just completely new to me, really. So yeah, I barely understood anything. and I made one note during the whole lecture seminar, which was 8th of November with a question mark. I'd got the impression that something important was taking place on that day, maybe with admin that we needed to do. And as you can probably guess, nothing happened on the 8th of November. The one note I made was even incorrect. But one thing that had happened by around that time, sort of early winter, was, by that point I was a few months into listening to French in all the seminars and lectures and just daily life going about Paris and stuff. And my listening level definitely had improved just from sheer exposure to the language. And by that time, I noticed there was one lecture one day where I think I might have been a bit tired, possibly, or even a bit hungover, and I couldn't be bothered trying to translate what I was hearing into English as I was listening, because it was not only because I was tired, but also because it was a bit demoralising, given that a lot of it was passing me by. But when that happened, when I didn't try to translate, all of a sudden, and I was just letting the French letting myself listen to the French itself, I found that I was actually understanding a lot more than I realised. When I actually let myself take in each sentence and not worry about translating it into English, quite a lot more of it was making sense than I thought it would. And from that point on, I realised that in the lectures, in the seminars, and in fact, whenever I was listening to French to immerse, I just needed to let myself hear the French language, not try to translate in those settings. So that was, a big step forward for me. And then over the rest of the semester, and of course during the second semester through to the summer, my listening level in French had improved a huge amount. And, there were plenty of bumps along the way. I remember I had to give a presentation in October to the whole class about the geography involved in the Spanish conquest of the Americas, in terms of their route across the sea, the Treaty of Tordesillas and stuff like that. And although the content wasn't too bad, I remember the class who, kindly of them, they were very patient, but then after 4 or 5 minutes of me, trying to get my presentation out in French, I could see their faces just sort of losing interest, as they were, they didn't want to have to strain to listen to my stumbling French any longer, really. And I don't blame them. But that was in October, so very early on, and by January we had oral exams for the foreign students. We had written exams, but also some modules the professors thought it was more suitable for foreign students to do oral exams, as they thought it would be easier for them. Now, as I've sort of explained, I actually found my written level in French was much more advanced than my spoken level, so I found it a bit harder. But most of the professors were, really kind and patient, and, very understanding of, as a foreign student, you'll have different, in different skills in French language, your level will be different. So, for example, my reading level was much better than my spoken level, for instance. But I remember one professor, she gave me a bit of a rant in her oral exam about diplomacy in early modern Europe, which I have to say, again, not a topic I was particularly enthusiastic about. And completely my fault. I didn't prepare well enough for that one, and combined with the fact that my spoken French still wasn't where I'd want it to be, she basically told me off for not having a good enough level of spoken French at that point. But the rest of the spoken exams in January went fine, and the written exams went well. So I was making progress, and then in the second semester, I noticed that, as I said, my listening had come on leaps and bounds. I could understand most of each lecture, each seminar, and that was a really nice feeling, comparing it to when I'd started and could barely understand anything. And the written and spoken exams, the oral exams at the end of the second semester went very well as well. So in the end, I passed the year abroad, passed all the modules I had to anyway, and it was an amazing experience that taught me how to learn languages. And it was this experience that enabled me to teach myself Spanish, as well as various other languages moving forward. So when I got back to my final year of university, I implemented everything I'd learned in Paris to teach myself Spanish, as well as, and then after that Portuguese, Italian, Catalan, and a bit of German, all for the purpose of dissertation research, but also, out of personal interest, wanting to immerse in those languages, learn more about the cultures of countries where those languages were spoken. And to do this, I distilled what I'd learned in Paris, and this came down to dividing the learning process into passive learning, active learning, and practice. Now, I won't go into too much more detail here, as I've covered it, extensively in all the ebooks available on my website and in this free video guide you can see on the screen, which also comes with a free ebook about how to learn any language, how you can apply these principles. So I'd recommend checking that out. I'll leave a link to that below. But just to briefly cover that, passive learning is just immersing in the language as much as you can, be it through podcasts and radio, series and films, reading when you can. And the key thing is, especially with the listening side of it, is to just do it purely for immersion. You don't need to be looking up the meaning of anything, and you certainly don't want to be trying to translate into English or your first language. It's just to get yourself as familiar with the sound patterns of the language as soon as possible. And what's great about it is, because it's passive, you can do it whilst doing other things, so it doesn't have to change your daily schedule. For example, on your commute to work, when you're cooking, cleaning, doing exercise, you can do it then. And you can easily build up hours and hours listening to the language this way. Now, active learning, it doesn't need to be like at school where you're, going through vocabulary lists, learning grammar rules in isolation, although you can learn grammar in isolation as an add-on to the process. If you enjoy that, that's fine. But you don't have to. Your active learning can simply be learning new phrases and sentences, in their entirety, not just focusing on individual words, but learning whole phrases and sentences. Now, I'll go into more detail, as I said, in other places and in this free video guide and ebook, so I'd recommend, learning more about that there. And practice, as you can tell from the name, is just having conversations with speakers of the language you're learning, be it typed or audio. But of course, especially spoken conversations will be the most useful for building your fluency in the language, because, spoken fluency, it's forged by making your responses to given situations, given questions, become automatic. So the more you practice having conversations, the more times you'll come across the same question or the same type of question, and eventually your response to that question will become automatic, and that's spoken fluency, really. So anyway, applying this to Spanish, for my immersion, I would listen to podcasts and radio in Spanish, such as, I remember there was a radio show based in Madrid all about football. I'd listen to that often when walking to university or walking to work in the evenings and weekends. And I'd also listen to a podcast by a Spanish YouTube channel called Español con Juan. Now, I wouldn't necessarily recommend this for passive learning in and of itself, because Juan deliberately speaks at a slightly slower pace to make it a bit less daunting for learners, and also, if people are wanting to focus on the words and see what it means and stuff without just purely immersing. So it's also great for active learning, his content, but I also at that time liked to listen to it in the gym, for example, where, for example, between reps in the gym, I'd maybe focus a bit more on what Juan was saying, just to try and actively learn some of the phrases he was saying, whilst also getting a bit of immersion also from, just listening to it too. But either way, whether you like to use content like that, for my passive learning since then, I've not really used content like that. I just use, authentic language in inverted commas, like, at the same pace first language speakers would listen to. But that sort of thing is a great, supplement to the process if you enjoy it, and you can use it for active learning more than passive learning, really. So, yeah, I listened to lots of radio shows in Madrid and would watch, lots of series in Spanish like La Casa de Papel or Money Heist, which you may well have heard of, very famous show. I also watched 1994, a documentary about politics in Mexico in the 90s, in 1994 specifically. Just, lots of great shows and films like that. La Casa de Papel is a series, but I watched a lot of films as well. And if you're interested in film ideas in Spanish, there's an area of the How to Learn Languages blog called Film Night, with loads of film suggestions in all sorts of languages. And we've also got the Spanish area where you can see Spanish films specifically. Now, for my active learning, I used Assimil, which is a French company that I came across whilst in Paris. I noticed their books in the bookstores in Paris, and I used their French book, as you can see here, to learn Spanish. Now, the reason I did this, as opposed to, for example, for your active learning, you can easily just, use YouTube videos but list phrases and sentences in the language and just learn them that way and save them aloud to yourself. But the reason I used Assimil was because I wanted to maintain the progress I'd made with French whilst learning Spanish, and also I felt that the fact they are closely related languages, both Romance languages, it would just make everything I was learning in Spanish seem even more familiar. So I felt I was getting, two benefits in one in that sense. And that proved to be the case. It was a very effective way to very quickly build my reading comprehension in Spanish, which was the key goal for me at that time. So going into my final year of university, you can pick various modules, but the main module, which covers the largest number of credits for that final year, is on a certain subject, and I chose the Spanish Civil War. And you also then write a dissertation based on something to do with that subject. So Spanish was going to be a fundamental part of my final year. So I was in a rush is maybe the wrong word, but I was keen to advance my reading level in Spanish as quickly as possible so that I could conduct research in the language. And also, as I've alluded to, just a genuine interest in learning more about the cultures of Spanish-speaking countries, being able to follow the news in Spanish, read novels in Spanish, read a lot of non-fiction in Spanish, stuff like that. So with Assimil, I won't go into too much detail, as there's a blog post there, the link to which will be below this video, where you can read more detail about how I'd recommend using it. But basically, the crux of their method, as you'll see in this picture, is that they have the dialogue in the language you're learning on the left-hand page, and a translation into a language you're familiar with, or your first language, on the right-hand page. So, if your first language is English, then they do have an English version for the Spanish book. I used the French book, as you can see here, for the reasons I just mentioned. And this dialogue format, it's very good in terms of you can focus on the dialogue in Spanish, but also you can check what it means in a language you're familiar with. And the great thing about learning through dialogue is you're learning whole phrases, whole sentences that you can apply in conversation. And that's a much better way to learn than focusing on individual words, because each phrase, each sentence contains its own grammar, so you're naturally building your understanding of grammar. And obviously each phrase, each sentence contains multiple words, sometimes many words, so if you learn the whole phrase, the whole sentence, you're learning many words in one go, as opposed to just going word by word through a list, which not only takes longer, it's less effective, as you're not learning through context. For example, learning a sentence within a dialogue, it helps you to remember it based on the fact that you will have naturally, learned that phrase is used in response to the question that came before in the dialogue, and vice versa. You'll learn that question is appropriate for asking about the sort of answers you see below that question. So it's a great way to learn. One drawback of it worth mentioning is that some of the dialogues in Assimil, they won't necessarily be things you're interested in or that feel relevant to your reasons for learning the language. And that's why, I'd always recommend also using other ways of active learning, be it sentences you find on YouTube, where they just provide lists of sentences on a topic you search for, or, using YouTube channels dedicated to learning a language. So in this case, Spanish, there's loads of YouTube channels for learning Spanish. And I'll include a link to a blog post and video I've done recommending some of those below. where, you know, they have loads of videos where they cover certain types of phrases on topics you'd be interested in, so you can learn that way too. One more thing to mention about Assimil is that their approach to grammar, I find, is a really nice balance for people who still want to, you know, check, you know, for clarification on some grammar points, but don't want to study grammar in isolation. So you can see here they have, you know, short notes about different parts of the dialogue where they either explain a bit of grammar or explain, you know, the context behind a certain phrase. So that's really useful. Now, after just about, it's probably maybe a few months learning Assimil, you know, I did maybe roughly 2 lessons a day because I really tried to motor through it to be able to research as soon as possible. I was able to read books by Spanish historians and, you know, primary sources in Spanish. Now, of course, that isn't to say I could read them as, you know, comfortably and as quickly as a first language speaker, as a Spanish speaker. But after working my way through Assimil, and because of the head start I'd had from learning French, I was able to quickly advance my reading level to the point where it was good enough to make the process of researching in Spanish effective in terms of time. You know, I wasn't having to waste hours looking up loads of words and stuff. So, yeah, that meant that for my dissertation research, I was able to, you know, navigate the website of la Biblioteca Municipal, a public library in Madrid, and email them in Spanish about arranging a research trip in the new year, where I would research or download to a USB pages and pages of 2 of the most widely read newspapers in Spain in the 1930s, because I was doing dissertation research into La Confederación Española de Derechas Autónomas, La SEDA, they're known for short, which literally means Confederation of Spanish right-wing groups, and my dissertation research was sort of analysing them and comparing them to fascist regimes in Europe at that time to, you know, assess, evaluate, you know, to what extent they could have been considered a fascist organisation or not, based on comparing them to other groups, other parties, other regimes in Europe at that time. So, and yeah, just a quick note on that. That also required researching in quite a lot of other languages. So, for example, fortunately I could already read French, so I was able to research like l'Action Française, a far-right group in France at that time. I could read their newspapers, which fortunately were available at my university in Leeds. And I also, online, was able to get hold of various primary sources like newspapers and documents in Portuguese to cover Salazar's Portugal. So after reading Assimil's French to Spanish book, I then did the same, but with the book for learning Brazilian Portuguese in Spanish. So on the left was Brazilian Portuguese, on the right was Spanish. So, and yeah, they're especially similar, those languages. And so I was able to quickly work through that and develop my reading level, at least, in Brazilian Portuguese, in Portuguese. And I then did the same for Italian and Catalan with Assimil, again, using that same method where I could keep maintaining the progress I'd made in the Romance languages I'd been learning to then quickly advance my reading level in another Romance language. Again, for the purpose of dissertation research, and also again, for personal enjoyment, being able to read books, watch films, watch the news in those languages. Now, yeah, for Catalan, that was useful for the Spanish Civil War. Barcelona played a pivotal role in many key events in the Spanish Civil War. So I was able to research in some Catalan sources for that. And also, I started studying German, again, enough to read some sources in German. I wasn't able to make as fast or as much progress as with the Romance languages, as it was, you know, from a different language family, and is widely considered to be just a little bit harder than learning Romance languages. But I was able to study enough at that time in German where I could read some sources in German without it taking too much time, you know, for dissertation research. Obviously comparing the situation in Spain to the situation in Nazi Germany. So anyway, that was how I was doing a lot of active learning in various languages during that semester, that first semester. And, although it probably sounds like, that rate of progress is a bit unreasonable, it's because, I was just focusing on reading predominantly at that time, and reading to a point where I could get by with research, not reading as in, I wouldn't necessarily have been able to fly through a novel in those languages where you're exposed to an even wider range of vocabulary, but it was enough to make research possible. And in terms of, speaking and writing, obviously my level in those languages I was learning, apart from Spanish, I wasn't able to spend much time on that. And I came back to that, at later dates when I had more free time too. So yeah, that's how I went about it. And then in January, I went to Madrid. Now it was 3 days, and 2 of those days were days spent fully in the Hemeroteca Municipal, scanning pages and pages of El Socialista and El Debate. So El Socialista was a socialist newspaper from the time, and El Debate was like a right-wing, or depending on how you define it, far-right newspaper from that time. And yeah, it was basically, contrasting the different ways they reported events that were happening, not just in Spain, but in Europe during the 1930s. So you can see here, this is the Hemeroteca Municipal, quite a grand building. And yeah, I spent 2 full days there. One day downloading, was scanning to a USB pages and pages of El Debate, and then the second day doing the same for El Socialista, which you see here. So this is one from the 31st of January, 1933. And yeah, as you can see here, you can really, especially with El Socialista, you really got a sense of the time, the sense of crisis for people on the left with the rise of fascism in Europe, especially in Germany and Italy, but also in France. You can see here a headline on the left about how there was crisis in France. On the right, the crisis in Germany, where Hitler had fairly recently ascended to power in Germany and essentially turned it into a dictatorship. Well, I say he did turn it into a dictatorship, of course, but it was reported in different ways. This is back in 1933, so different countries and people of different ideologies were reporting it in different ways back then, I guess. But yeah, very interesting window into the 1930s. And what after just I'll get back to the process of learning Spanish, but what was fascinating about this and quite spooky, I guess, was seeing, obviously especially in El Socialista, who given their politics, their ideology, understood full well what Hitler was and what was happening even back in 1933. As someone, obviously, we're looking at this almost 100 years later, and knowing full well what happened, all the awful things that happened in Europe in the following decade. It's spooky and also really sad to read about how alarmed people were as this was happening. Now, of course, in contrast to that, El Debate, the far-right paper I researched, their headlines were either, celebrating, the crushing of strikes in Spain, not speaking in any ill terms about Nazi Germany or Mussolini's Italy in particular. They were usually very complimentary or neutral at best about it. And yeah, they were often just talking about wanting to crush the left in Spain, that sort of thing. So it was a real contrast, and it provided a fascinating way to work through the years in Spain during the 1930s, seeing what was happened and how different sides viewed what was going on. And yeah, of course, it was great practice for my Spanish as well. Now, I as I said, spent 2 full days in the archives, downloading those onto USB to research when I got back to Leeds. And I had, what little spare time I had, I spent walking around Madrid. This is Príncipe Pío, very nice area, like nice park. And aside from that, just finishing a big essay that was due in a cafe. So it was a busy but very enjoyable experience, but it really gave me the confidence to do the other primary source research I mentioned in other languages. So it wasn't only very helpful for my Spanish, but it also gave me a lot of confidence learning languages in general, because, although I'd done similar stuff in Paris with French, as I said, that ability to do that was kind of forged during the experience itself. But this was the first time I'd been able to do it with a language where I'd taught myself the language. Or certainly, taught myself Spanish in terms of being able to do this. Even though I'd studied it for some years at school, as I mentioned earlier, the limitations of school are that, inherent limitations of learning a language at school are that I had to do the vast majority of this myself to get to this level with Spanish and Italian, Portuguese, Catalan, etc. So that was a wonderful experience, but after that, I, for the second semester at university, as I said, I was focusing on the other languages as well, and didn't actively learn Spanish at all. I just kept my Spanish going by, continuing immersion with films and series here and there when I had the time. And that was all I did from then on for keeping my Spanish going and trying to improve my Spanish, just through passive learning. So by the summer, I was very fortunate to have the opportunity to volunteer as an English teacher for 1 month in Ecuador, which of course is a Spanish-speaking country in South America. Now, as I said, from when I went to Madrid till that time, I didn't spend any time practicing Spanish. It was all focused on other languages, so my spoken Spanish was very rusty when I arrived in Ecuador. I could speak Spanish, but I had to really think when I was saying phrases when I first got to Ecuador, because it had been a while since I'd spoken the language. And that's normal. That applies to any language you learn, really. Of course, the more fluent you become, in terms of your spoken fluency, the less rusty you'll be after a certain amount of time. But there's usually at least some element of rustiness when you start speaking a language again after a long time not speaking it. And just to quickly mention, this picture here is a view from the plain of Cotopaxi, one of the most famous volcanoes in Ecuador. You can see it from Quito. It's very beautiful, and I guess it watches over the city, but of course as a volcano it also has the power to erupt and cause some damage. Although, an interesting thing, or fascinating thing really, about visiting Ecuador, where there are so many volcanoes, having the Andes running through it, that people have a deep respect and reverence for volcanoes and the mountains and the natural world in general, because they're very aware that even though it can be destructive at times, this destruction also creates the conditions for life. For example, when a volcano erupts, it nourishes the soil within its vicinity, which means lots of crops can be grown, for example. So when I got to Ecuador, I did do a little bit of preparation for my Spanish, to get familiar with it again. And so the main thing I did on the plane there, because it's a long flight from Europe to Quito, was I read a novel called Baldomera by Alfredo Pareja Diez Canseco. It's widely considered to be his greatest work. And he was from a group called, I think, Grupo de Guayaquil, which is, the biggest city in Ecuador on the coast. And their movement, he wrote this in the 1930s, their movement aimed to depict the realities for indigenous communities in Ecuador and African Ecuadorian communities in the country, of their daily life, which was, full of hardship. There was obviously a lot of racism, sexism as well, and a lot of the working class and the peasants had very tough lives, especially back then. And yeah, his novel, Baldomera, focuses on Baldomera, an African Ecuadorian woman who faces all sorts of hardships in her life, having to struggle against the society she's living in at that time, which is 1920s Ecuador in Guayaquil. And, aside from all the personal hardships she has to endure during the novel, as I said, this Grupo de Guayaquil, their ethos apparently was, to ground their novels in reality as much as possible. And so a lot of what Baldomera faces in the novel depicts, very real conditions for African Ecuadorian communities and indigenous communities in Ecuador at that time. And one of these in the book, which is a very real event from Ecuador's history, a very famous event, is La Masacre de Obreros del 15 de Noviembre de 1922, which means the massacre of workers of the 15th of November 1922. And in the novel, Baldomera is on the front lines of this. She's defending her comrades against the brutality of the Ecuadorian army, who, with the authorization of the president, whose name I forget, I think it was maybe Jose Luis Tamayo, but I forget exactly. It's in the corresponding blog post I've written for this video below. But he was a liberal, of course, and he authorized the Ecuadorian army to put down the general strike of November 1922. And so on the 15th of November, the Ecuadorian army killed anywhere between 90 and 900 workers, estimates vary. But yeah, in the novel, Baldomera is at the front lines of this, and after staving off the attacks of officers, she eventually, with some of her comrades, has to flee for her life. So that, reading that on the plane to Quito was, aside from being a great way to improve my Spanish by reading a novel, because novels have a wider range and depth of vocabulary than non-fiction usually. It was also a great way to learn about Ecuador before arriving in the country. Obviously, there's so much more to Ecuador than just this novel, but to learn about something important in Ecuador's history and the different communities in Ecuador. And as I've said, that's one of the most important motivations for learning languages. I love being able to learn about the cultures, the history of different places around the world, and how people have lived and how it's shaped the world we live in today. So when I got to Quito, immediately after landing at the airport, I had the opportunity to practice my Spanish for the first time in months in the taxi journey from the airport to the hostel where the volunteers stay. And fortunately, the taxi driver was very friendly, recommended Ecuadorian food and so on, and he asked me, what brought me to Ecuador, what I thought of Antonio Valencia, one of the greatest Ecuadorian footballers of the last few decades. So it was a great chance to talk about different topics, but also, as I said, my Spanish was very rusty at that point. I was really having to strain to think what I was going to say because it had been so long since I'd spoken it. But fortunately, and this applies to any language you're learning, even though you'll be rusty when you've not spoken it for a while, if you've made a lot of progress previously, then it won't take you that long to get back in the swing of things. It took me a couple of days or, a handful of conversations to really get back in the swing of things and for things to flow more naturally. So that was great. And, I was very fortunate to spend a month in Ecuador. And Quito is a long city, because it's wedged between the Andes. So it's a very long city. So some of the taxi journeys can be very long, which means you get lots of time to practice talking about loads of different topics. I remember there was one driver called Jaime who, he did several trips for us across the time I was there. And so that meant, over, hours spent driving up and down Quito. We were able to talk about all sorts of things. He gave detailed explanations of his work as a sound technician, but also, talked about his views on marriage, life, the army even, the role of the army in a country. So that was very interesting. And yeah, great way to practice my Spanish. And, you know, it's worth caveating, by the way, this can all sound very nice and wonderful, but, you know, every conversation I would make mistakes in Spanish, but that's all part of the process. So I don't want you to think, oh my God, this would be unrealistic for you, like, to be able to speak about these things. You will make mistakes when you're talking about these things. I made plenty. It's all part of the process. So don't even think about mistakes when you're learning a language. It's an essential part of the process. And, you know, you can still, you know, you don't have to speak perfect Spanish or, you know, a perfect form of any language to be able to practice the language. So don't worry about that. And yeah, just be sure to immerse in the language as much as possible and do your active learning in the way that you enjoy most. So another conversation I had, a very memorable one, was with a sort of late middle-aged lady who was driving a taxi as, you know, to earn extra income. And, you know, she was very kind, very warm, was, you know, happy to talk about all sorts of topics. And I remember at one point she was sort of bemoaning the dominance of English in the world because she found it too difficult, too expensive to learn. I was sort of joking with her in Spanish, saying, you know, it's the end of the English language, don't worry. And, you know, we had just a great laugh and a chat in Spanish, and it was just moments like that when you get to stop and really appreciate why you've learned the language, you know, where you get to share experiences like that with other people. And it makes it all worthwhile, because there will be times when you're learning a language, especially during the active learning, where, you know, your motivation will be lower and you just don't feel like learning the language that day for all sorts of reasons. You know, could be anything, you know, external reasons. And so, you know, it's important to just take a moment to stop and enjoy and be grateful for the moments where all the hard work you put in pays off. So be sure to do that when you're learning the language and when you're learning Spanish. Now, she was actually dropping me off at this stadium, Estadio Rodrigo Paz Delgado. I think I might have got the words in the wrong order there, I can't quite remember. But its nickname is La Casa Blanca, the White House, and it's the home of LDU Quito, one of the main teams in Quito. And I was going there to arrange tickets for myself and a few of the volunteers to watch a Copa Libertadores match between LDU Quito and Boca Juniors, you know, one of the main teams in Argentina, alongside River Plate. And yeah, we had a great experience going to watch that. Remember, and at that time, actually, this was 2019, Antonio Valencia had just moved back to LDU Quito from Manchester United, and Carlos Tevez was playing for Boca Juniors on the night. So as a United fan, that was great to be able to see those two playing live again, and especially against each other in, as you can see, such a beautiful setting. You know, the stadium, it's in Quito, which is nestled in the Andes. You can see a mountain in the background there. It's just, yeah, an amazing place to watch football, and the atmosphere was incredible. So yeah, I felt very lucky to be able to have that experience. And if you're ever fortunate enough to get to visit Ecuador or Quito, I'd definitely recommend going there. Now, another place I've had the chance to visit, you know, at the weekends, because we'd volunteer Monday to Friday, and then we'd have the weekends available to explore Ecuador and, you know, visit different places. One of the places I went to was Baños de Agua Santa, which is about 5 or 6 hours bus ride southeast of Quito. And when I was there, I had a chance to go paragliding and have, like, you know, a really niche Spanish conversation about the weather conditions required for paragliding. Now, in terms of Baños, it's worth just mentioning a bit of Ecuadorian folklore just to bring it to life even more. The villages surrounding the Chimborazo volcano, which is Ecuador's highest point, believe that a pregnant woman caught amidst a storm will give birth to an albino, a son of the volcano. It is also told that Taita Chimborazo is an envious husband to Mama Tungurahua, the volcano that watches over Baños. It is said that when thunder rages through the valleys of the province, It is Chimborazo and Tungurahua glaring and arguing with each other. Two smaller volcanoes that lie close to the feuding couple, Carihuayrazo and El Altar, are said to have been beaten by Chimborazo in a battle for the love of Tungurahua. Now, when we reached the hillside deemed suitable for lifting off for the paragliding, the two guides said that we'd need to wait a bit as the weather conditions weren't appropriate. So that turned out to be a great opportunity for me to have a conversation in Spanish about what weather conditions are required, for paragliding to be possible. And yeah, it came down to like air pressure and how clear the sky was and how this affected the air pressure and the wind, stuff like that. Now, the details are lost on me a bit. I've forgotten some of them, but at the time, even though I didn't know every word they mentioned, I was able to follow the general explanation. So yeah, it's an example of how, when you're learning a language, and if you're fortunate enough to come into contact with speakers, from different professions, different backgrounds, you'll come across, you'll end up having conversations in the language that you'd never envisaged having before. So yeah, again, it's one of the joys of learning a language. And, as I mentioned earlier about taxi journeys, this was again one of those moments where I'd recommend, whichever language you're learning, just taking a moment to stop and appreciate what you've just been able to do, whether that's, as a beginner learning new phrases and, the moment where you feel like you really know that phrase, or if, a bit further along the process and you've just been able to have a conversation about the weather conditions required for paragliding in the Andes. Just whatever it is, be sure to take a moment to enjoy and feel grateful for the hard work you've put in during the process, as it, really helps with motivation, and, you just should anyway, because, it is an enjoyable process. One thing it's worth mentioning about the Spanish language in particular is the pace of Spanish, because, a lot of people, either when they're learning Spanish or thinking about learning Spanish, they will hear, someone from Madrid rattling away in the language and think, goodness me, I can't be learning that, it's far too fast. And it's true that in some parts of the Spanish-speaking world, Spanish is spoken very quickly, especially in Castilian Spanish in Spain. But it varies from region to region, and even from town to town, village to village at times. If we take a look at Ecuador, now you see here it is in the northwest of South America. Now this Quito here is Quito, because my computer's in Vietnamese, but you see here you've got the Andes running down here. Now this region, people in this region are known as serranos, i.e. people in the mountains, or people of the mountains. And you've got here to the east, this is the Amazon, the Ecuadorian Amazon. And of course, we just zoom out again, you see it goes on for thousands of miles. An absolutely huge expanse of land, expanse of rainforest. And this is Ecuador's, beautiful corner of that. Now, this region is known as El Oriente, which means the east, for obvious reasons. And then what you have in Ecuador is you've got the Amazon, the Andes, and then this area here leading to the coast. And people living along this area are known as costeños, i.e. people living along the coast. It's often said in Ecuador that the pace of spoken Spanish can vary a lot, and I certainly found this to be the case when I was in Quito here and other parts of the Andes. I found that people spoke Spanish in a very nice way. It was a very gentle, not slow, but certainly not fast pace of Spanish. Very easy to understand if you've been learning Spanish, for example, based in Madrid, where it's a lot faster usually. It feels a lot easier to understand. And just a very nice form of Spanish in that sense. Now, costeños, Ecuadorians often say, speak the language at a faster pace. Now, that might be because, for example, Guayaquil here, which we looked at with Baldomera, that is Ecuador's largest city by population, and it's its largest port. It's, very important to the Ecuadorian economy. And, as with a lot of port cities around the world, there's a very fast pace of life. And, that includes the language. The language is spoken at a faster pace. But again, just to highlight how much this can vary from region to region and place to place, if you look at the map here, I was fortunate enough with some other volunteers to spend a weekend in Montañita, which is this seaside, I guess seaside town, but it was not very big. You could almost call it a village, really, in terms of its size. And yeah, we flew to Guayaquil from Quito because it was much faster, and then we got a bus. Got a bus from Guayaquil up to Montañita. It took about 3 hours, and even though it's on the coast as well, that 3-hour journey to a coastal village as opposed to a port city, people spoken Spanish in Montañita was much slower than Guayaquil, a bit more like in the Andes. And, you know, even within that there was variation. I remember one person speaking to me who barely got their words out, although it might have been the time of day, because it was a popular seaside village with, like surfers and then like a lot of nightlife and stuff. Well, a bit of nightlife. And yeah, so just a much more laid-back atmosphere than Guayaquil. So the pace of spoken Spanish will vary a lot based on, place to place. So yeah, when you're learning Spanish, don't be daunted by the fact you will come across very fast forms of the language. If you're, what I'd recommend doing if you're not worried about focusing on a specific country's Spanish, say, you're wanting to, or you live in, say, the Dominican Republic and you're just wanting to use resources based in the Dominican Republic, then, that's fair enough, no worries. But if you don't have any specific circumstances like that in mind, then what I'd recommend doing is using a variety of resources to immerse in so that you get used to the different paces of the language. So, for example, in my case, listening to very fast radio shows based in Madrid, talking about football, when I came to the Andes and heard the Spanish spoken there, it felt very easy to understand because I was used to much faster paces of the language. So, yeah, I'd recommend doing something similar if it suits your situation and your goals. Now, just to quickly look at the map of Ecuador a bit more, because it's worthwhile. If we zoom in here, this is Baños here. So in relation to Quito, as you can see, a little bit of a distance, so it was about a 5-6 hour bus journey. This is Cotopaxi here, one of the most famous volcanoes, visible from Quito. And over here, this here is Chimborazo, the highest point of the country. And yeah, one of the volcanoes mentioned in the folk tales I mentioned earlier. So yeah, you've got here Chimborazo and Tungurahua over here, near, looking over Baños here. So they were the feuding couple mentioned in the folktale, Tungurahua and Chimborazo here. And yeah, the paragliding was sort of over here. Now, just as a final 2 places worth mentioning on the map, Tena here, this is often the gateway to the Amazon for people wanting to, visit the Amazon in Ecuador, because you can, go off downriver here. And Otavalo is a beautiful town in the Imbabara region, and with, lots of indigenous communities and a very famous market at La Plaza de los Ponchos, which we'll talk about shortly. One of the greatest joys I found learning Spanish was that it gave me the ability to learn about the indigenous peoples of Latin America and their languages. So you can see here on the screen, this is a mural in Kichwa, one of the main languages or language groups, depending on how you want to define language, in Ecuador. And also, you'll have heard of Quechua with a slightly different spelling in Peru and Bolivia. They're all related. They're, obviously variations in each region and each country, but related languages. And, there's a significant proportion of Kichwa communities in Ecuador amongst Ecuador's indigenous communities. Now, this was a beautiful mural on a wall in Quito. Now, myself and a few of the other volunteers were lucky enough to have a weekend to visit the Amazon. And yeah, when we visited there, our guide, Jose, he was from a community in the Amazon that were a Kichwa community. Now, of course, there's loads of other indigenous communities in Ecuador and in the Amazon, but his community was a Kichwa community. And he explained to us that, Kichwa communities in the Amazon would speak, different forms of Kichwa to the Kichwa communities in the Andes, such as in Otavalo. So, and it's sometimes these dialects or languages, depending how you want to define them, wouldn't always be mutually comprehensible. So that was interesting to learn about. And yeah, what shone through when Jose was talking to us, the guy, he did his tour in Spanish, so it was again great practice for my Spanish. But what shone through listening to Jose was his and his community's deep knowledge of their living environment of the Amazon. There was we'd be walking past, as you can see here, caimans in the waters, like glaring at us, and he would be pointing at leaves and fruit, saying mucha energía, meaning this thing would give you lots of energy. And he would often say si se puede, which is a common chant in Spanish, meaning like yes, it can be done, or different ways of translating it. And there were times where he shoved his hand into a termite's nest and they were crawling all over his arm and he was just laughing away. Another time, he was telling us about the history of cinnamon, loads of cinnamon trees in the region. And also one of the most incredible things I've ever seen, really, at night. For those of us who wanted to, he offered to do a bit of a night tour near where we were staying, in the jungle, to show us some things. I don't think none of the others fancied going, but so it was just me and Jose, and he was carrying this machete along with him. And he just stopped at a random tree that there were hundreds, thousands of trees, and he just stopped at one which didn't, to people not from that region, it looked like any other tree. And he got his flashlight and with his machete peeled back a bit of the bark, and nestled under the bark was this big tarantula, just chilling in that tree. And Jose, because of his profound knowledge and understanding of the Amazon, just knew which sort of tree a tarantula would be hiding in. So it was an incredible experience, but also it was a great amazing experience learning about Kichwa, the Kichwa language, and the Kichwa communities in Ecuador. Now, just quickly, this photo, apologies, it's a very grainy photo, not a good photo, but I wanted to show you because this place, this river here you see in the background is the Jatunyasu River, or Jatunyasu. I can't remember how it was pronounced, whether according to whether people used a sort of Spanish pronunciation or a indigenous language pronunciation. But what was so cool about this bend in the river that Jose showed us was, you can see here the jungle fanning round, but then, the Andes in the background. So like the Andean foothills in this region were slowly sloping down into the Amazon, and it was just, one of the most spectacular scenes I've ever seen, really. It was just stunning. Apologies, it's a grainy photo, but wanted to show you that. And I'll just quickly, for context, show you where that was. So we got the bus from Quito past Baños down into Tena, which is like the main city as a gateway to the Amazon, and Jose showed us around Puerto Napo. But then we also stayed back up here, and I can't remember exactly, but the Jatunyasu River is one of these around here, and it sort of arcs down. So in that picture you're seeing like the foothills of the Andes as they descend into the Amazon, and then arc down into the main river. So this is the Napo River, I think, from what I remember, and that eventually, as a tributary of the Amazon itself, will lead into the main river over here. So yeah, just an amazing experience, and a great way to practice Spanish and learn about the rich, array of cultures in Ecuador. And so what it did was it gave me even more, encouragement and enthusiasm to learn more about Kichwa. Now, I'd already decided that I'd wanted to learn a bit of Kichwa and learn more about the history of the Kichwa people before going to the Amazon, but, speaking to Jose was a great opportunity to learn even more about those things. Because when I'd got to Ecuador, I'd sort of tried to plan ahead a bit about how one weekend I'd visit Otavalo, the market town I mentioned to the north of Quito, where, most of the people there are Kichwa. And so I wanted to learn as much Kichwa as I could, so that when I visited the market, I could speak in Kichwa with people there. Now, I didn't just want to do this because, it's, just generally a really enjoyable, really nice experience to be able to speak to someone in their first language, but also because I'd read a bit and seen some videos about how this is a problem throughout, in any country in Latin America, where because of the erosion of indigenous culture and language that's taken place, with varying degrees and intensities since the Spanish conquest in the late 15th and 16th century. And since then, indigenous communities are of course very proud of their culture and language, as they should be, but because of the erosion of it, which has taken place because of Spanish, the self-esteem of indigenous culture and indigenous language is sometimes eroded to the point where, I saw a video which talked about how, it was an interview, interviews conducted with lots of people in Otavalo about whether they choose Spanish or Kichwa names for their children, and a lot said Spanish, not because they're not proud of their Kichwa culture, but because they felt it would be more useful for their child to have a Spanish name, for job opportunities and stuff like that. So I just, as one person, just as, I can only contribute what I can as a person to wider stuff. So I'm fully aware this isn't changing the world or anything, but within what I can do myself, I wanted to at least, by speaking Kichwa with people in Otavalo, show them that, a random foreigner from a different continent cared about their language and about their culture. So anyway, that was my motivation for learning Kichwa, and, the relevance to Spanish is that learning Spanish is what made that possible for me. So, that's a big reason I'd recommend learning Spanish if you're thinking of learning Spanish. Now, as you can see, these books here, I managed to get, this was from a university bookshop in Quito, a grammar of Kichwa, some Kichwan stories and a history of the Kichwan language, as well as some other books like a Spanish to Kichwa dictionary, stuff like that. It wasn't, I had to sort of use bits and pieces from each book, but I was able to put together some phrases to use at the market. To give a bit more background on Otavalo, because I think it's worth it. So you'll see here a bit of footage of Otavalo. I don't take pictures, or, unless I'm taking a picture of somewhere and it happens to include people, say I'm taking a picture of, a mountain and there happens to be people in the shot, or, a temple and there happens to be people there. But other than that, I never, obviously take pictures of people themselves, but I'd still like to describe to you the scene at Otavalo Market, because it was a wonderful setting and a wonderful experience. So I definitely recommend going if you have the opportunity in future. So Otavalo is an old market town nestled between volcanoes and with beautiful lakes nearby. The respect shown by Ecuadorians to such natural wonders is evident here. Its watchful volcanoes, Imbabura and Cotacachi, are seen as guardians of the area and its people, and are often referred to as Taita Imbabura and Mama Cotacachi, which is Kichwa for Father Imbabura and Mother Cotacachi. Many myths abound of the relationship between the explosive couple, the most famous of which is about the stone in the nearby town of Peguche, known as Achili Pachacamac. Considered sacred by the local Kichwan people, It is said that Imbabura threw the stone at another nearby volcano, Mohanda, as they were fighting for the affections of Cotacachi. However, the stone fell short of its target, apparently because Imbabura had grown weak from womanizing. Otavalo and the surrounding settlements are blessed with an array of lakes, which also carry their share of folklore. A famous legend of Otavalo tells that an Inca prince and princess threw themselves into the Mohanda volcano after they were forbidden to marry. The lovers then resurfaced as lakes Cuicocha and Yahuarcocha, straddling the towns of Otavalo and Ibarra. The market at Plaza de los Ponchos, in the heart of Otavalo, is a chance to see the crafts of the Kichwan people of the Imbabura Valley. All sorts of foods, embroideries, clothes, hats, ornaments and paintings are available to buy, and though bartering can take some getting used to if it's your first time, it adds to the atmosphere of the place. I'd arrived around 8 in the morning, and as I turned a corner a hub of life came into view, in the form of stalls at the corner of the square. Though the rest of the town still seemed asleep, Plaza de los Ponchos already appeared to be close to full swing, with smiling traders greeting me warmly as I perused their wares. The people were dressed in the typical Andean fashion. The men wore white trousers, ponchos and felt hats, from which protruded their ponytails. The women were dressed with even more charming colour, their white blouses adorned with woven flowers. They also wore long skirts and headscarves known as fachalinas, as well as gold beads and red coral bracelets to guard against evil spirits. Their braided ponytails completed the picture of Andean craftsmanship and beauty. Though there's an array of handmade crafts on sale, the most well-known are probably the woolen ponchos and alpaca sweaters, as well as the famous Panama hats. The hats are made from paja de toquilla, a soft but sturdy straw found in the coastal province of Manabí. The hats have been made as a shield against the rain since before the Spanish conquest, and the misnomer only emerged after it became a popular form of headgear for workers digging the Panama Canal at the end of the 19th century. I bought one as a souvenir, as well as several other gifts for relatives. It hadn't been in my plans, but I felt compelled to buy something extra. On a stand that sat along one of the plaza's borders, a beautiful collection of ornate miniature chess sets cast their eye over the rest of the market. I had no intention of playing chess, but I bought a set for its beauty and skill alone. The small board was colourful and compact, able to fold and store the pieces, which were brilliant painted figures of Kichwan people on one side, Spanish conquistadors on the other. Now, that's from, the blog post I wrote accompanying this video, and I thought it was worth actually reading that part out because I wanted to capture, exactly how, I felt going to the market and, how many things there were to see there. Now, when I was there and passing through one of the stalls, I said to some people behind one of the stalls who smiled at me, Ali Puncha, which means good morning in Kichwa. And, sort of smiling but also very surprised, they said to me back, Ali Puncha. And then they said, Hablas Kichwa, which is Spanish for, do you speak Kichwa? And so I then spoke in Spanish to explain that I'd been learning Kichwa because I wanted to learn more about Kichwa language and culture and the Kichwa people. And obviously the question they asked, I hadn't been able to prepare a phrase in Kichwa for that, so I'd responded in Spanish. But then I was delighted to hear them respond by saying, Mashna tiempo. Now, tiempo, you may have heard before, is time in Spanish, but mashna is the Kichwa word for how much or how many, i.e. how long. So he was asking me, how long would I be in Ecuador for? So, and then obviously I had to respond in Spanish because again I didn't have enough phrases in Kichwa to respond in Kichwa, but I was delighted because even in that short interaction I'd been able to show them, that someone, some random foreigner cared about their language and culture. And also I was very pleased when I could understand mashna, the word he used, when he asked how long I'd be staying in Ecuador. So just all round it was a wonderful experience. And the reason I've gone into some detail recounting it for you is because I consider it a pivotal part of my journey learning Spanish, because, you know, any language you learn, your motivation for learning the language is an essential part of that. And this was a key motivation for me. Now, of course, when I started learning Spanish, or when I started teaching myself Spanish anyway in my final year of university, I didn't know that, you know, I'd specifically be wanting to focus on Kichwa in Otavalo, but I knew that I'd want to learn more about the indigenous languages and peoples of Latin America after learning Spanish. So yeah, this was a key part of the process for me. So I thought it was worth telling you about that. Now, as a final thing on that, to really bring it to life even more, I'd like to just show you a quick clip from a YouTube channel called Apak Otavalo, which is the channel I mentioned. I saw, you know, doing the interviews in Otavalo, and, you know, their whole channel highlights, you know, the beauty and history of indigenous cultures in Otavalo, but in Ecuador as well. And yeah, I thought I'd show you this clip so you could hear the Kichwa language, but also some Spanish, and get to see Otavalo. Because as I said, I didn't take like pictures at the market, because I think it's rude to, you know, just take pictures of people without their permission. So yeah, we'll just quickly watch 1 minute of this video and I'll explain what's going on. Under one sun.
El pueblo Kichwa Otavalo, habitante de la provincia de Imbabura, al norte del Ecuador, dedica su trabajo a la producción de tejidos y las transacciones comerciales. La agricultura y la ganadería son actividades complementarias. Uno de los elementos distintivos de esta cultura es la vestimenta tradicional. Lo diferencia a este grupo de otros pueblos originarios del Ecuador. Una de las prendas principales utilizada por los hombres del pueblo Kichwa Otavalo es la ruana o poncho de lana, que tradicionalmente se tejía a mano. En la actualidad ya casi no se hacen ponchos manualmente, sino que se usan otros materiales como el paño.
Punda Joana Okunata, Jaya Joana Okunata, imagina Joana Piscina Punda Casina. Coisa Okuna e Matiacari, just now Okunamanda Kazariskan. Nekataita Kunama Sina Karar Kanacho, Randispa,
So, yeah, the man at the end there was saying that he's been wearing a poncho since he was 4 years old, and you know, they would wear ones without a neck back in the day, and when he was little, his father bought one for him as a gift. Now, one of the phrases in Spanish you'll have heard there was poncho de lana, which means woolen poncho, and yeah, that's the material most commonly used for them. And if you get the chance to visit Ecuador, and indeed many places in the Andes, you'll see those everywhere. So my time in Ecuador had been not only an amazing way to practice my Spanish, you know, my spoken Spanish, and listening in Spanish had improved even more after my time there, but it was also just an incredible experience in general. So if you're interested at all in, you know, some of the things I've mentioned about Ecuador, I'd recommend visiting the link below to International Volunteer HQ's Ecuador page, where it mentions, you know, the projects they run in Ecuador. It's a wonderful country, incredibly friendly people, and yeah, it's just a beautiful place. And yeah, I don't know if I will, but I hope I'm lucky enough to get the chance to go back there one day. It's an amazing country and amazing people. Now, after coming back from Ecuador, my active learning with languages has focused on, you know, Mandarin Chinese and Vietnamese mostly, and also to some extent Russian and German. So I haven't been actively learning Spanish since. I've just kept my Spanish going with immersion in the language. So that's been, you know, films like Argentina 1985, Mar Adentro, Roma, and the main actress in this film, Yalitza Aparicio, she also has a YouTube channel where she talks about elements of indigenous culture in Mexico, and it's videos like that, learning about interesting things in the Spanish-speaking world that I've used to keep maintaining and improving my Spanish whilst focusing on other languages. So I'll just show you a quick example of that from her YouTube channel, talking about how chocolate is made in Oaxaca, in Mexico.
Hola a todos, muchas gracias por estar nuevamente en su canal, Yalitza Aparicio, y el día de hoy los traje a Teotitlán del Valle, un lugar maravilloso en el cual vamos a aprender un poco sobre el proceso del chocolate, y nos tomamos el tiempo para venir a el sabor ancestral de Oaxaca con nuestra amiga Aurora, y vamos a ver cómo se prepara el chocolate, así que vamos.
So I would watch videos like that about interesting topics. I would also follow news sites like Telesur, you see here, Página 12, El Faro, and La Jornada. Now, another thing I do would be read novels. I tend to read non-fiction, but any language I'm learning, I do try to read at least one novel. But although I'd already read Baldomera, because I was so interested in Ecuador, I got some more Ecuadorian novels to bring home and read. So two of these are two of the most famous works of Ecuadorian literature, Huasipungo and La Emancipada. And one in the middle here is just a collection of Ecuadorian folk tales, Leyendas Ecuatorianas. And aside from that, I've also flicked through some other books that I've wanted to get the time to read but haven't had time to yet. So one is Ignacio Ramoné's biography / autobiography of Fidel Castro, which is, he conducted hours and hours of interviews with Castro, and the book is formatted in that way. So it's easy to, it's a long book, so I haven't had enough free time to read it cover to cover yet. But what I sometimes do when I've got 5 minutes spare here and there is flick to a question in the book and just read the answer to that question to practice my Spanish, and just read about an interesting topic from Cuban history. And the other, Las Venas Abiertas de América Latina by Eduardo Galeano. Now, obviously, very important and interesting topic about how the United States and the West has exploited the resources of Latin America over the centuries. And so obviously I wanted to read it to learn more about that, but also in terms of the Spanish language itself, Galeano's writing style is well known for being very poetic, very beautiful. And what I personally admire about that is he's talking about very important topics where some people say with analysis, historical analysis, stuff like that, you have to be analytical to the point where they almost say, you need to write in quite a dry fashion. In other words, but they say you shouldn't be emotive about it, because there's this idea that good history shouldn't be subjective at all; it should be totally objective. Now, I don't agree with that personally. Obviously, it's very important to be analytical, but emotion's an important part of everything in life, and I love the fact that in Galeano's writing, he doesn't shy away from making these, sticking to the emotional impact of these issues and this history. So, for example, I've taken a picture of inside the book here just to quote to you a little bit. So this one on the left is from the first page. He says, La división internacional del trabajo consiste en que unos países se especializan en ganar y otros en perder. Nuestra comarca del mundo, que hoy llamamos América Latina, fue precoz. Se especializó en perder desde los remotos tiempos en que los europeos del Renacimiento se abalanzaron a través del mar y le hundieron los dientes en la garganta. Now, he's talking about how the International Division of Labour consists of countries specialising in winning and those that specialise in losing. And he says, our part of the world that today we call America Latina has specialised in losing since the earliest times in which the Europeans of the Renaissance crossed the sea. And this last bit is very, very vivid and very emotive. He says, "Y le hundieron los dientes en la garganta," and sunk their teeth into the throat, i.e. sunk their teeth into the throat of Latin America. So, whilst learning about the history and issues that are very relevant to the Spanish-speaking world, you also, by reading Galeano, you're exposed to very vivid and beautiful use of the Spanish language, obviously in a very, very sad context in some cases like this. And just another example on the right here, this is from deeper into the book. His subtitle here, "La economía norteamericana necesita los minerales de América Latina como los pulmones necesitan el aire." Now, maybe a bit less poetic, but still very, very vivid. He says, "The North American economy needs Latin American minerals like lungs need air." So just, throughout his book, just every page, there's, beautiful ways of describing stuff and very emotive ways of describing stuff, which just a very interesting experience in general, but also a very good way to improve your Spanish. So yeah, I'd recommend finding books, or articles on any topics you're interested in, be it, fiction or non-fiction, and just spending as much time with the language as you can, both because it's an enjoyable experience in and of itself, and it will improve your Spanish a lot as well. Now, just as a final thing, I just want to show you the How to Learn Languages website briefly, because, if, when listening to me talk about how I've learned Spanish, I've gone into great detail because, the journey learning a language is specific to each person, but there are fundamental principles needed to learn any language. And the beauty of the age we live in, even though obviously it's wrought with its own problems and so on, is that you can learn a language from anywhere as long as you have an internet connection. So, I was very fortunate to be able to go to Madrid, to Ecuador, but you don't have to have that to learn Spanish. You can immerse in Spanish with podcasts, radio, series and films, etc., and books online. And you can actively learn using all sorts of resources online, including YouTube channels and so on. And you can practice with Spanish speakers on apps like Tandem and HelloTalk, or if you have, expats in your local community who speak Spanish as well. So you can learn a language from anywhere as long as you have an internet connection. And all I've learned during the years, because it was like over 5 years ago that I went to Ecuador, and I've been learning other languages since. All I've learned over the years learning languages, I've sort of distilled into guides, that are ebooks that take you step by step how to through specific languages. So I'll just show you here. These are the guides here. Each guide comes with, its ebook, which are very detailed, taking you step by step through how to learn that language, giving you a flexible plan where you can choose the methods and techniques that suit you, but all of them will follow the fundamental principles for learning languages, like passive learning, active learning and practice. So you can learn the language in a way that suits you and that is enjoyable to you. And in each guide, I provide you with links to, more than 100 at least, free online resources you can use on all sorts of topics. So you can follow the topics that are relevant and interesting to you. And I also, in each ebook, have a short section called A Short History of Italian for the Italian book, A Short History of Spanish for the Spanish book, and so on, where I teach you the history of the language, I give you an overview of its history just to add context. And each guide, each ebook comes with a welcome video, a 30-minute video where I show you how to get the most out of the guide, and a checklist PDF so you can keep track of your progress. So yeah, if you're wanting to learn Spanish or indeed any language, I'd recommend taking a look at those. But if you're feeling confident with how to go about learning a language already in terms of, the method and so on, but you'd want to save yourself hours and hours looking for resources, then I also have here the resources section where these ebooks, it's just the resources from the guides. So the guides have all the resources covered in these ebooks, But in these ebooks, it's just for resources. So, you know, all the resources you need for active learning, passive learning and practice for Chinese, Italian, Spanish, and so on. Like Vietnamese, Catalan, Portuguese, German, French, and Russian at the moment. Whenever I learn a language, whenever I actively learn a language, I then make a guide and resources ebook for that language. So yeah, be sure to check those out. It will help you a lot with your journey learning a language. And if you ever have any questions about learning a language, be it Spanish or any language, please feel free to email me at contact@howtolearnlanguages.info and I'll get back to you promptly. I'd be more than happy to help. And yeah, I hope this was helpful for you, this video showing you how I learned Spanish. Any questions, let me know, and do feel free to read the blog post below, the corresponding blog post, as you know, I go into some more detail there. And yeah, enjoy learning Spanish. Buena suerte.